going on? I'm going to take about 2 minutes to allow people to come back and log in. I'm listening to a little Miles Davis. Let's have this conversation tonight. What's up, TikTok? What's up, LinkedIn? What's up, YouTube? How are you this evening? We're about 45 more seconds. On time tonight. This is good. And in depth. Tap the screen on TikTok. Make sure you tap the screen. The more you tap the screen, the more people can join the conversation. Tap the screen, like the live, share the live. The more you tap the screen, the more people, the broader the reach will be. And so we want everybody who can join the conversation tonight to be able to join the conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I do appreciate your presence and your support. I need to we need to offline. All right. So tonight it is 7 p.m. I believe in being on time. And to be on time is to be before time, and any other time is late. So tonight's conversation is about why fairness feels like a threat. I'm Dr. Relia Johnson. I am your favorite sociologist, the identity professor, aka the people's professor. This is episode 4 of Hijacking Equity. Last week we talked about joy as a strategy. We talked about how do we situate joy in our lives to where it is not um, it's not contingent. It doesn't rely on other people. It's not external validation that we're seeking. It is internal validation that we are seeking. We talked about how do we find joy in our world, small w, so then we can find joy in our world, big W. And so there's some things that we left with last week that we needed to really sit with. So, how have you found joy? What has been your method? What's been the practice, the strategy that you have used in the last week to really make sure that's a lot of words to ensure that you are practicing joy, you are finding joy in all of the chaos and confusion? And how are you using joy to disrupt the chaos that is happening around you? This conversation, though, is going to be led by Toni Morrison. She said, if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. I know that I've read Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and The Bluest Eye at least 5 times each. Morrison is my literary North Star and has had a profound impact on my life and how I frame the world. Um, Morrison not only commanded language, she had an astute understanding of how language impacts perspectives and behaviors. For example, when Morrison had a conversation with Charlie Rose about the consequences of racism, she raised a valid point, and she said that those who practice racism are bereft, that there's something wrong with the psyche. But when you take it away and there you are, all strung out, what are you without racism? Racism is at the core of anti DEI legislation, and racialized capitalism is at the core of ICE raids, the removal of civil rights attorneys in the Department of Justice, and compounded when our president speaks about civil rights and says that white people were very badly treated, that the people that deserved to go to college or deserved to get a job were unable to get a job, so it was reverse discrimination. And in this thinking, which is bereft of accurate historical accounting, is currently fueling the conversation around fairness. And so tonight's topic again is when fairness feels like a threat. And one of my thoughts is if fairness was upheld or were being upheld by US policies and laws, then why was there a need to create historically black colleges and universities? Why was the Greenwood district burned to the ground? Why is there an expulsion of Black women from the workforce? That's because fairness, as we have been taught and trained to believe in it, is not real. It is impartial. It's above history. It's above bodies. On fairness, on paper, fairness reads like a virtue. It sits in classrooms, churches, and courtrooms like a stained glass window, casting a shadow upon your face as if to say, I got you covered. However, fairness doesn't. Toni Morrison, in her book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, addresses the mental experiences, creating a reflection on the subject. Power or people cheated, murdered, raped, and thieved their way to it do not know how to be self reflective, in my opinion, for fear of having to be self revealing. In other words, those who benefit from and whose identities are formed within the confines of white supremacy have not and do not define nor experience fairness like others. For example, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, I was on the debate team, the internationally acclaimed Texas Southern University debate team. Shout out to the debate team. And we have been competing all season. We were traveling, we were preparing, we were sharpening our arguments. We were up to sometimes at the crack of dawn. We were in stairwells talking to corners. We were just locked in. And we were so locked into what we were doing that there really was no room to question our abilities. We knew that we were walking into a team that had a long history. We understood the people that were a part of the team. We understood the reputation that we needed to uphold, and we walked in with our back straight. So by the time we arrived at this particular tournament, my debate partner and I were locked in. And so we were parliamentary debaters. And at USAFA, we were winning round after round. It wasn't narrowly. We didn't win in a way where people were questioning whether or not we deserved it. These were convincing wins, right? We were in sync. We knew the material, we knew the structure, we knew ourselves. And by the time we reached the semifinals, it was clear that we had earned our place in that match. And not only had we been trained to be excellent, we were trained to outwork, to outthink, to outperform. Now, I'm not sure if this was naivete on my part or expectation or idealism, but we assumed that the rules, if they existed, which they did in this tournament, they would matter and they would be fair. But by the end of the semifinals, we had learned a different lesson. First, the judges for that round were coaches from the opposing team. That was illegal. And then, second, the final statement that the opposing team told the judges were if they were not 100% sure that we had proven our argument, that the round should go to them. Now, this is linguistic prestidigitation, right? This is, a loophole that they were taught. Now, I'll give them that. The judges gave their analysis, right? And in the end, they did say that our arguments were stronger, that we were more convincing, our analysis was sharper, but that they were only 97% sure that we had proven our case. 97% sure. So the decision was made to advance the other teams to the finals. And it wasn't because they had really earned it, but because authority and their coaches, being judges for the round, permitted it. So in that moment, right, it became very clear that you can be better than good, you can be better than most. And even when you're better than that, people will take that from you. During that same tournament, I competed in individual events. So I did prose, I did poetry, I did dramatic interpretation. And there was a piece that I was known for. This piece was not only my ace in the hole, like this was my signature piece to perform. And I could do it either as a prose piece or I could do it as a dramatic interpretation. And if I was placed in the middle of the round, or if I was placed at the end of the round, even sometimes if I was placed to lead the round, to open the round, I knew that the piece was going to kill. There was just no way that somebody was going to be able to top this piece. However, I placed, but the girl who placed first used props during her performance, right? And I mean, like, that's illegal. If you know anything about a debate tournament, you know you can't use props. You got yourself, your black book, and you better be able to block, like, use your body to tell the story. But she used real tears, which is a prop because you can tear up, but you can never drop a tear. And she used post-it notes, and she placed first, and I second. And actually, one of my teammates came up to me during the award ceremony and just said, matter of factly, Aurelia, you were robbed. So that was another moment, another lesson where I understood that fairness is conditional, that it comfort the hierarchy. So one of the things I want to say is that I want us to walk away with is that fairness is conditional, and that it is negotiable, because it depends on who's privileged, who has the advantage, who's in power or has perceived power, and if they are in a situation to where they could lose, right? So if you're talking about real competing, if you're talking about leveling the playing field when it comes to fairness, it has to be unconditional. Otherwise, like, people don't really have to compete. They can just change the rules. So that was one of my first lessons, and why fairness feels like a threat to those who refuse to accept the reality that they are subpar. And instead, they choose to cheat instead of compete. And let's be real, the attack on wokeness, on critical race theory, on diversity, equity, and inclusion are about competition, the outcomes of a level playing field. And yet, every day, we teach our children to play fair, to be good sports, right? We teach them that at their core, humans are good people, right? That fairness is tangible, that it is real. But unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that it is not. If you start with the word fairness itself, fairness is defined as an impartial or just treatment without favoritism or discrimination, as well as the quality of having light colored hair or pale complexion. That's not a coincidence, that's ideology. So, do y'all remember? And I'm checking the comments. I hear you. Do y'all remember when Malcolm? Have you ever watched first? Have you ever watched the movie X that was directed by Spike Lee? That was, Denzel Washington. He starred in it, and he was playing Malcolm X. There is a scene in that movie when Malcolm was in prison and he was first learning how to express himself, right, without using profanity. It was a whole conversation about it. And he was taught, he was, the guy that was working with him basically was like, here's a dictionary. First thing that they wanted Malcolm to look up was the words black and the words white, right? And so he was being introduced to these definitions. And so he was really perplexed about how these words were situated against each other. And that's because they're built in negations and oppositions and binaries in the English language. More specifically, binaries in American English serve a purpose while servicing the dominant ideology. In 2020, I wrote, ideology is an illusion beholden to the ruling class based on materiality that constitutes one reality for the ruling and another reality for the rule. C. Wright Mills calls it vocabulary of motives. If you've read Edmund Burke, he calls it rhetorical motives. And I, of course, said that language dictates patterns of thoughts and behavior. Like, if we take the last 12 months of our lives, I want you to really think about, what do you notice from January 25 to January 26, just that small snap of time. What you'll notice about language, what do you notice about the conversations around fairness, the narratives that are being spun by the historically advantaged. There is a motive, and the motive is to neutralize progress. Liberation movements and ideologies is to neutralize the unity among working class people and to situate false narratives as the norm. So look at what has happened in the response to the deaths of Keith Porter, Renee Good, and even Alex Preddy. what do you notice about the narrative that is being spun? Right? Some of those folks have been identified as terrorists, as problems, as the dangerous others. And then what we realized within the death of Alex Preddy is that initially that was the response, but because he is situated with a certain gender and a certain racial identity, uh, there was some crab walking, right? There was some walking back of the conversation that they were having around him. But those that have been situated as social others, they were labeled as problems. They were called domestic terrorists and aggressors when we could all see in the video who the aggressors were. And so my question to you was that fair? Right? No, of course it wasn't. Because when normal normal becomes invisible to itself. What do I mean by that? So in 2017, Andrea Ritchie published this book called Invisible No More, and she documented the racialized and gendered mistreatment of Black women, girls, and transgender people. For example, in Chapter 6, Policing Gender Lines, Ritchie writes, the lines of gender are drawn most literally between a false gender binary that tolerates no deviation in appearance, behavior, or expression from the characteristics associated with gender assigned at birth, leading to suspicions, presumptions of instability, criminality, fraud, and violence in police interactions with transgender and gender nonconforming people, particularly those of color. Now, listen, hold on. I need y'all to really hear what I'm saying. I understand how people feel about gender. I understand that this is a hard conversation on me. And you start, gender. My point is about what's fair. I need you to take the thesis out of Richie's statement and apply it in a more expansive context, right? Black people exist in a racial binary that tolerates no deviation in appearance, behavior, or expression, leading to suspicions and presumptions. Let me be clear, that's walking while Black, that's talking while Black, that's living while Black, that's succeeding while Black. Now, I want you to think about that and tell me if that is fair. So, first thing is, when fairness feels like a threat, it is because it is conditional and negotiable when you have to compete on the level playing field. Number two, fairness threatens to reveal the status quo. Racialized narratives about Blackness and whiteness are imbued in our language, media, healthcare, education, and legal systems, which are rooted in the mythology that white means morally, intellectually, physically, and ethically superior. Sheikh Anta Diop explored this inversion in his book, The African Origin of Civilization, where he writes the social condition of the Negro in the modern world engendered an entire literature to describe the so called inferior traits of the Black. And now, if you don't believe that that's what he said, go to the 1974 edition, turn to page 25, and you will find it there. Now, in 1837, John Calhoun warned the nation about the dangerousness of abolition, and he posited that the differences between whites and blacks were rooted in the physical and intellectual variances. He further explained that the white race had not been spiritually or socially impacted by enslavement, and that there was no difference in the progress of whites in slave and non-slave holding states. He wrote, "It is odious to make comparison, but I appeal to all sides whether the South is not equal in virtue, intelligence, patriotism, courage, and all the high qualities which adorn our nature. The caricature of the superior white and in the inferior Black is foundational in both race relations and the narrative necessary to bend fairness in one direction." It goes on, like, if you look at Harriet Washington, I think I think it might be in the other room. But in her book, Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington provides context on the genesis, evolution, and continuation of beliefs about Black people. She writes, according to polygenists, Blacks were physically inferior and were liars, malingerers, hypersexual, and indolent. Blacks were often compared to beasts. Later in the century, comparisons of European children reigned instead. The slave became a Peter Pan in blackface. Now, if we're thinking about in contemporary America, stereotypes and falsities about Black people underpin judgments, biases, and interactions. For example, in our current education system, Black children, in comparison to their white counterparts, are 3.6 times more likely to be suspended, 3.4 times more likely to be expelled, 2.4 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement due to a belief in punishment over correction, control over guardianship, and surveillance over support. However, the appearance of fairness remains intact, while underlying assumptions about who is threatening, disruptive, or in need of correction quietly preserve whiteness as a standard. This malignant alignment with the status quo shows up in healthcare. Black patients are still less likely to receive adequate pain management or timely treatment. Now, we all saw this happen in real time in November 2025. It was all over TikTok, it was all over the news, it was all over social media. There were at least two Black women who were in active labor who were largely ignored by medical staff despite their presentation of being distressed and in pain. One of the women, Carrie Jones, reportedly gave birth just 12 minutes after the recording, where she was largely ignored by the intake specialist. I think she was a nurse. There was another woman, Mercedes Wells. She was sent home in active labor. It was visible. She got down the road 8 minutes and ended up giving birth in the car, in the truck that she was driving with her husband, right? Both incidents reveal that even within life or death situations, fairness is performed rhetorically and denied materially. So I can say from personal experience, I have been in a medical situation where I was in distress. And I had a nurse who came in who, instead of looking at me and examining me, she was looking at the machines and reading what the machines were saying. And if it had not been for a Black woman coming into that room, I may not be here right now. I wish that was hyperbole. It is not. That woman physically looked at me and she could tell that something was wrong. And because of that, she sent me down to have some other scans done, and then they actually found a problem, right? So, staff in both cases, sometimes it's not even like just these two cases. Is staff is oftentimes more concerned about the paperwork, what that says. Sorry, y'all. Somebody called. So sometimes staff are more concerned about the paperwork than the health and safety of the mother. These are not anomalies, like I just said. These are contemporary expressions of the same ideological structure. Now, at this point, I think it's necessary to acknowledge the multi-directional people who are racialized as being white that are reinforcing this status quo. Let me be very clear. There are people of color, there are Black folks who participate in this same type of performance, right? So Black folks reinforce and perpetuate the same isms. Let me be very clear. This is not me letting anybody off the hook, because nobody is off the hook at this point. Like, we're going to have to call a thing and be able to have real conversations. Black folks internalize and rationalize a narrative that impacts the historically undervalued and those who benefit most from the lie. For example, and I'm not calling these brothers out because I am practicing some type of misandry, right? I'm calling them out because they have substantial platforms, because they have been in the news, because these are public figures. These are people that are actually, like in politics and are in government right now. So I want you to think about Tim Scott and Byron Donalds. Now, these are two men that are, again, these brothers are entitled to their opinions, okay? However, their positions are harmful, and they support the status quo. So Byron Donalds is a congressman from Florida. He's made statements about the Black family. He's made statements about Black families' impact and how they were intact during Jim Crow. that they are more conservative at the ballot. Their moral and ideological commitments are very different. And I understand that there are people who prescribe to those political orientations, which, if you're conservative or whatever it is, that's your business, right? I'm not never going to argue that, because you have the right to choose, your political leanings. But some of these conservative talking points that he has spewed lack historical analysis. Okay, just outright ignore, right, reality. And Donald, in his case, he omitted why was it necessary, the necessity in community formation in response to dehumanizing policies that often relegated Black people to the underclass, right? So if you listen to Donald's, if you go back and find them on YouTube, or you Google it from CNN, or those conversations where all of those videos were taken, it would be easy for the ignorant and the ill-informed to conclude that the creation of Black middle class represents the singular marker of progress, right? And then he goes on to talk about legitimacy in marriage and marriage rates. And he really espouses that the only means of legitimate reproduction is in marriage. And that in itself is problematic, especially because of the history that comes along with that. So E. Franklin Frazier, which is one of my favorite philosophers and writers, in 1997, this is the 1997 version of the book, but he wrote The Black Bourgeoisie. And he depicts this type of thinking as a, quote, deep-seated inferiority complex that exhibits considerable confusion and conflict. So we go on to talk about Tim Scott, right? So during his candidacy for president in 2023, he made some sweeping statements about the myth of systemic racism and stated that America is not a racist country. His proof was legislation that he sponsored about anti-Semitism on college campuses and the false correlation he posited as the rise in hate crimes in the nation not being indicative with the soul of America. Yet not one time did I hear Scott talk about hate crimes against the socialized or the others, right? So Black folks, LGBTQ people, Latino people, those that are coming from Eastern or Pacific parts of the globe, the disabled people, those that are up in age, right? So according to the Department of Justice, hate crimes are on the rise the same year that Tim Scott was campaigning, and that 52.5% of all hate crimes reported were related to race, ethnicity, and ancestry. Now, listen, again, I am very clear, right? Donald and Scott are only two individuals. They are Black men. I recognize that 100%, but they have a substantial platform and access to those who legitimize power through policy that center the status quo and pontificating about fairness and believe in the infallible righteousness of a nation's will to provide all of its members with every means to become functioning, contributing members of society. But my rebuttal to the Tim Scotts and the Donalds of the world is very simple. That racism is in both the historical and the contemporary serves a purpose. And it has a particular relationship with fairness. Racism allows whiteness to externalize its own moral corruption while simultaneously disavowing it, thus creating opportunities to perform fairness without the threat of disrupting whiteness. In other words, there are people performing in white face that would have you to believe that America is a post-racial, colorblind society that only rewards individuals based on merit, excellence, and intelligence, which is a smoke screen for fairness. Now, my third point about fairness reveals the truth. Or my third point is fairness reveals the truth. So one, we talked about fairness as being conditional. It is something that you can negotiate to, especially when it is positioned as a threat. Two, fairness reveals the status quo. And then my third point is fairness reveals the truth. Now, this is probably, I'm not gonna, yeah, I think this is probably the difficult part of the conversation for me, because there is a need for me to fully articulate the dilemma being presented here. And while confronting those lies that have been beaten and burned into the American psyche, this is the dilemma that we cannot escape as people. I'm not really low energy tonight, y'all. I just want to make sure that we're having a sound and robust conversation. So I've taken notes, and you see I'm quoting, okay? Um, so this part, I'm gonna go back to November 5th, 2024. I watched as the world watched. I anxiously awaited the results that I think myself and others were hoping to come, that would be reflective of the Declaration of Independence when it says it is the right of the people to institute a new government, most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. I remember holding my breath, counting the Electoral College votes. I was waiting for her to take the stage, hoping that 107 days would be enough, right? I was waiting for her to show up at our alma mater. And I remember feeling that, or thinking that, how anxious I was must have been like way more anxious for the vice president at the time. I thought about the weight she carried on her shoulders, the constant process of being fact checked, the constant correcting of the pronunciation of her name. How hard is it to say Kamala? And the defense that she had to go through when it came to her racial identity. Was she black enough? Was she too black? Was she not black at all? That foolishness, on top of having to defend a track record. Now, you can argue with Kamala's track record. You can argue with what she did as Attorney General. You can argue with what she did leading up to her presidential bid, what she did in the Senate, what she did as the vice president, right? You can do that, right? But you have the right. However, what I would admonish you to do is to go and look for yourself, and really look at what she did in her political career. So, um, what happened, or yeah, too many thoughts. So ended up, I wake up that morning. It was about 4:30 in the morning, and I right at when CNN is announcing who won the presidency, and I was like, okay, and I just remember being shattered. I remember being just kind of taken aback, and it really felt like the wind had been knocked out of me to a certain degree, because there I knew that what I knew what was going to be coming after that, and I was just hoping that fairness was going to be enough, and that we were going to live out our truth. And now that I'm thinking about it, like the word true, when you're looking at it etymologically, right? So I was an English teacher, y'all, so I always got to go back and look at the word and break the word down. True means accordance with fact or reality. It's something that is accurate or without variation. Truth is antithetical to alternative facts. I'm gonna say that again. Truth is antithetical to alternative facts, aberrations of historical records, apparitions resulting from whitewashed information. The truth is something that can be proven, which is different from repetitive statements mediated and propagandized for public consumption. That is not truth. That is the reckless and intentional dissemination of misinformation to advantage those who benefit from lies. For example, according to the election data reported by the Pew Center, um, in 2020, Joe Biden won Hispanic voters by 25 percentage points, but Trump drew nearly even with Vice President Harris among Hispanic voters, losing them only by 3 points. And Pew also says that men under the age of 50, as well as non-college and rural voters, provided the president with sizable advantages in lieu of almost doubling black voters from 8 to 15%. Now, in context, we all know that the 92% understood the assignment, that the 92% did what needed to be done, because the 92% understood that reality and truth were two additional things that were on the ballot. And furthermore, the election results revealed the seduction of proximity and truth about the consequences of class politics by unmasking the lie about who the system was built to serve and by exposing those who were breaking their necks to serve it. Fraser talks about this in the same book that I mentioned earlier, which is The Black Bourgeoisie, that this kind of betrayal and aloofness is the results of the ascendancy of what he calls the gentleman. And I'm saying lady, right? Because I'm gender inclusive. And that it's a means of social separation. Fraser writes, blacks who assimilated the morals and manners of the slaveholding aristocracy while calling attention to the element which was striven more than any other element among Negroes to make itself over in the image of the white man. Okay, so hear me out. Hear me out though, because I know y'all like to cut up. I know you like to cut up. Don't cut up on me right, no, right now. Okay, don't cut up. Now here's the thing. There's nothing wrong with a desire to do better. Let me be very clear. You have not read Fraser's book, The Black Bourgeoisie. I think my copy is in the other room. Read the book. So that's a hard stop right there. There's nothing wrong with a desire to be better. There's nothing wrong with you wanting to gain access. There's nothing wrong with you wanting to provide opportunities to yourself, resources to yourself, your offspring. There's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with success. There's nothing wrong with that. I am not saying that. But there is something questionable about the abandonment, right, that comes along when you're trying to situate yourself next to whiteness, as if the only legitimate version of humanity and expression is in that racialized identity. Now, unlike Fraser, right, I'm talking to all peoples of color, right? So, Fraser really wrote the book for Black folks, right? And there's a particular historically Black college, university that he was referring to in that book, so y'all should read it. But what I'm intentionally speaking to those also who share cultural heritage and experience with me, right? I have to go back to Morrison and her Nobel Prize lecture in December 1993, where she spoke about all the brilliance, where she spoke with all the brilliance in the world when she said, "For our sake and yours, forget your name in the street. Tell us what the world has been to you in the dark places and in the light. Don't tell us what you believe. Don't tell us what to believe or what to fear. Show us belief's wide skirt and the stitch that unravels fear's call." This conversation is not about fear. It's about unraveling the truth and unlocking fairness when the truth is at stake. Language provides us with accessibility. It is an under armor, a tool, a strategy to dismantle and assemble, to relinquish and replenish thoughts about ourselves and the world around us. The truth is our friend, one that may have long vanished from the immediate vicinity, right? But the truth is still a lifelong friend nonetheless. And this moment in history requires us to remember our friend and our friends while acknowledging the strides that we have made and our refusal to revert. We cannot go this time. And I am not assuming anybody's risk that you can or cannot do something. Everything that I say to you is adoptable and adaptable. It is malleable and it is flexible. It is amenable to your particular place in life. Last week we left with two questions, right? Well, about centering joy, how we're going to do that. And this week I'm going to leave us with the same two questions. One, when you encounter something that is being labeled as fair, whose interests are actually being protected? And I'll put that in the chat. When you encounter something that is being labeled as fair, whose interests are actually being protected? And the second question is, what risk, hierarchies, or power relations does the language of fairness make harder to see? Those are the questions we are asking ourselves as we go throughout this week. When we encounter something labeled fair, whose interests are actually being protected, and what risk, hierarchies, or power relations does the language of fairness make harder to see? There are three things that we talked about tonight when we are in this conversation about when fairness feels like a threat, because it does to certain people. There was a sister I was talking to. I think her name is Amy. Amy called me last week, and so sorry. That's my grandmother calling. I had to call her back. Um, I met a sister named Amy last week, and so she likened fairness to a seesaw, and it was really cool. And so she was like, when we think about a seesaw, it's leveled, but if you have been situated to sit at the top of the seesaw, and if you are now talking about equity and it is leveling the seesaw, if you're sitting at the top and now you're being brought down, to you that feels like you're losing something. And when she put it in that kind of metaphor, I was like, yeah, like absolutely. It made me sit and think about fairness in a different kind of context, right? Um, and so now that's what I want us to be thinking about. Why do we need to have a conversation about fairness, and why is this conversation about fairness leaning a particular way? So because I wanted to be more scripted this week, this was not as improvisational as the other conversations that we have had. I wanted to really hone in on these particular points. When it is a leveled playing field, fairness feels like fairness becomes conditional. It is something that is negotiated. Fairness feels like a threat because fairness reveals the status quo. Fairness feels like a threat because it unearths the truth about what is happening around us. So, I have enjoyed you all this evening. Oh, announcement again. If you have not placed on your calendars March 29th, please save the date for March 29th. It is a Sunday. We are having the Joy is Strategy online experience. Registration is opening very soon. It is March 29th at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. We have a number of dynamic speakers that are going to talk that morning. So get your favorite cup of tea. I think my tea has gotten cold. Get your favorite cup of tea. Keep your PJs on. Put your PJs on. Put your comfy socks on. Get you a snack. Get your cute little charcuterie board. Get your little breakfast. Order your little DoorDash or something, or have something prepared, and be ready to have that conversation with us, and be a part of that online experience. Registration will be opening very soon. I'm very excited about the speakers and the topics that they are presenting. Enjoy is strategy, the online experience, and then we're working on some other things. So I'll be very. I'm excited about announcing those things, but we'll announce them as we get closer to the date. But again, save the date for March 29th. Put it in your calendars. Registration is going to open soon for Joyous Strategy, the online experience. I thank you all for joining me today. Shout out to Sigma Pi Alpha. Shout out to Texas Southern University debate team. Shout out to all the people in Houston. Listen, happy Black History Month. It's been 100 years since Dr. Carter G. Woodson came out with Black History Week, that then eventually evolved into a month. This was a vision and a brainchild of his that we are still acknowledging and that we need to celebrate. Even though that there are some folks that are trying to do away with uh, the month, the acknowledgement of the sacrifices that Black people, and the sacrifices and the contributions that Black folks have made to this country. And yeah, like, shout out to everybody who's celebrating Black History Month. Shout out to everybody who celebrates Black History Month 365 days of the year. If you can see, I don't know, maybe TikTok can see, but I have on my Basquiat tonight. I got on my earrings. You know what I mean? Oh, I got to do the lip. So tonight is not lip bar. It's Juvia's Place, right? I got on my Juvia's Place tonight. So we're like 2 minutes ahead of time. So I'm just want to make sure I get you out of 45 minutes. But again, thank y'all for joining. Share the live, like the live. I will see you next Wednesday for episode 5 of Hijacking Equity. Have a good night. Talk to you soon.